Welcome to another Mailbag. Remember, these are questions and comments that you guys leave on the channel, and I think are worthy of being shared with the wider tuber audience. But before we get started, there are the normal parish notices. So they are, if you haven't subscribed, the subscribe button is over there somewhere, or down below. If you want to be notified about when new content hits the channel, it's the bell icon. Consider supporting the channel on YouTube. The address is down there, as are the Instagram and Facebook feeds, so go find me over there. That's where you'll be notified about things that are happening outside the YouTube channel. But back to the main video. This first one is from the Aria Tights. Okay, and this was left actually quite some time ago, and it is actually in response to the Roland Aira TR3, TR8 System 1 connecting the modules together video I did way back in 2015. And you will forgive me because this is actually probably going to be quite a long question and comment and answer, and I'm going to have to read it. So anyway, they write, I don't know whether it's male or female, so they write, the Rift on the System 1 wasn't such a good idea to use for an example. It just made everything sound so loose and messy. Also, it isn't a matter of simply connecting the leads from device to device. You also have to consider which MIDI channel each device sends and receives on. For instance, I use the TB3 out into the System 1M modular version of the System 1, which doesn't have the keyboard, and when I first tried, nothing came out of the M1. I asked on a few forums before someone advised me on how to set things up, as the default MIDI channel was, for example, 1 on the M1 and needed to be changed to 2. And then it worked instantly. However, then you have the controls to consider. DAW example, when running the 1M from the TB3 MIDI out with the MIDI of the course going into the 1M by default on my setup, anytime I twiddle a cutoff or resonance knob on the TB3, I would sometimes have extreme effect on whatever the sound was coming out of the M1. So you must tell the M1 or whatever device the MIDI slave is only accept note commands and not control commands. Sometimes it suits me to keep the control signals on, as that spontaneity and uncertainty can produce a great unexpected coincidence, but oftentimes it's better to keep the control commands off. There are times when using MIDI completely gets in the way of certain aspects of making music, depending on your preferred technique or achieving the effect. For instance, I prefer running my drum machines and my TB3 really fast, and usually for dance stuff at 300 BPM. That is fast. However, that doesn't mean my stuff sounds so fast, as I have bass sounds and accents emphasizing at 75 or 150 BPM. So what I'm doing is giving myself a much higher resolution of paces to place notes to get more detail into what I'm doing, and extra weight to the sound. However, apart from the fact the M1M, for example, crashes too often when I run at nearing 300 BPM, which is pretty poor for such an expensive piece of that's meant to be pro, for me it needed always to run fast. Anyhow, I'm generally using it DAW atmosphere and effect. I'll have it slaved to a virtual rack on my PC via MIDI at 150, or sometimes in the need the TB3 to run at 300, but the TR8 at 150 and 1M at 75, about half of each other, so they all just fit, and just won't connect them all as it would ruin what I'm trying to do. I have to match the grooves from my earphone manually, much like what Plastic Man Richie Hawtin had to do back in the 90s. And the main thing to do in this case is to remember, as long as they go at the correct speed or fractions of speed, they are in key. That can be relative when you do what you want. So we need to know the rules of how things are done. But once we need that, you don't let it get away in the way of what you need to create what you feel. MIDI, yes, not MIDI. Sometimes yes, and getting back to my point, it isn't always a matter of simply plugging in MIDI connectors, but also setting the devices to certain MIDI channels, as default settings might not work for you. And so that was quite a thing, and it goes on actually. I noticed too the lacking comments below that the above video is lacking in full details of how to make it work. Perhaps it might be true that this will work for some out of the box folk, but for most of us the above will not work. Because the default MIDI channels will be different for each device, that's why everybody below here are not getting any sound out the TB3 and System 1 or the System 1N. If I remember correctly, as I only had to do it once, it was a while back now, I generally hook up the TB3 up to the M1 and had to go under the hood on the M1 by holding particular buttons that I switched the power on, took what MIDI channel it was set to, and either had to reset it to channel 1 or channel 2. Then it works straight away. But if you don't tell people this, then they'll have some pretty negative experiences. Incidentally, MIDI is very useful for much, but can just be much of a hindrance. Often I just beat match manually and have to do the nothing connected via MIDI and use the select button on the MX1 to make sure they are all good before I send through to the master. So never worry too much about only going down a certain route, but we'll always try to know about things you need to know about, right? The above video does not take into account that many out-of-the-box devices will be set to different MIDI channels. Learn how to set them correctly before doing what the guy in the above video is doing, or you'll get no audio from the slave devices. Okay, that was a fair old comment. And it deserves a good answer. And I have to be honest and say, so before I get into the answer, there are a couple of things kind of seem to have been lost in the periods of time, especially as we've now gone on over to sort of mainly USB devices. And one of those things is that there was kind of an unwritten rule about certain things being on certain MIDI channels. For argument's sake, typically a drum machine would always be on MIDI channel 10. Okay, and your lead synthesizer would typically be on MIDI channel 1, and your rhythm synthesizer would typically be on channel 2. You know, there were these sort of kind of unwritten rules about which channels you put things on. And I kind of made an assumption in the videos that I did that it was all about connecting the devices together, not necessarily changing the MIDI channels. Because I've done videos about MIDI channels in other area videos, so this is kind of just trying to sort of keep it in. But he left 2 fairly lengthy comments about this video, and as you know, my stance is that if the comment is constructive, and I thought they were constructive, then I allow it into the community. And you know, the confession is they were left about 2 years ago, and as you will know, I'm catching up with videos that I haven't commented on, where I think comments are needed. And I've only been able to do that recently since YouTube put in a different filtering mechanism. So, first of all, I did read them. I thought to myself, how am I going to answer these? And this is kind of the comment. So the comment about the riff really confused me, and then I realised that you meant the arpeggiator. So it wasn't really a riff, it was just me setting the arpeggiator off. And I think at the time I was trying to demonstrate that if you increase the clock speed on one device or slow the clock speed down on one device, and it was probably the drum machine, the TR8, that the arpeggiation slowed down or increased. So that was kind of what I think I was trying to get across there. It wasn't necessarily actually playing riffs on the System 1 to show the talents of the System 1. That really wasn't what I was doing. So that was the first thing. So, but it did confuse me. It confused me quite a lot, actually, because I'm sitting there thinking I'm not playing this. Now, the MIDI channel comment is really interesting. As I said, the video does assume a certain level of knowledge about MIDI. And I think I'm going to try and do a video. I started doing a video about a year ago about MIDI and setting up MIDI, and it kind of got lost in everything that was going on around me at the time. I've got portions of the video actually on my storage system, or on the Mac about me actually doing that stuff. And then I got so far and I stopped. And the reason I stopped is because the graphics weren't particularly good and I wasn't really getting across what I was trying to do. But I am going to do that. Now, by default, out of the box factory configuration is the clock will transmit from the TR8. Okay, irrespective of the channel, any channel it's being received on or is listening on. The TR8 is a drum machine, and by default will listen for MIDI on channel 10. Okay, so that was kind of what I said earlier on. It will also send MIDI on channel 10 by default. That's kind of how the drum machine's set up. The port out and through port on sending devices needs to be set to out, so you can't. It's not through. You need to send it to out. In the through setting, it will just retransmit what's being received on the in port. So that doesn't kind of work. As the clock is being generated on the TR8, it will not get retransmitted. So you need to make sure that's working. On the devices that you're daisy chaining in the ARIA boutique range, the out and through ports need to be set to through to allow the clock to pass through it. So if you don't do that, the clock won't pass, or you'll get the clock from the device that it has out rather than the clock from the device at the beginning of the chain. Through should be the default setting, by the way. But for the video, I own the equipment. There should be a video on how to check this. So I've done various videos on how to set this stuff up. So if you go and look at those videos, it will tell you how to set the out ports, the out and through port to the correct configuration. Now, admittedly, if you bought your own equipment secondhand, then you have no idea what settings the lunatic who owned that equipment before you set. Okay, my personal rule of thumb is I do a factory reset as soon as I get any piece of equipment. I go through the sounds. If there's anything worth harvesting, I take that. But if there's nothing worth harvesting, then pretty much I just factory reset, wipe it back to factory. It's a known quantity. And I've had instances, especially with my DX7, where I changed something and I don't know what I changed. It took me months to figure out what I changed because I couldn't do something. The second point I make is that some equipment does not receive the clock from an external source in Omni mode. Okay, what I mean by this is that specific MIDI commands can be transmitted on any channel and the target instrument will understand the command irrespective of the listening channel. Okay, so quite often with MIDI and most MIDI instruments, the clock is channelless, if that makes sense. But note and control information is channel specific. So you kind of need to understand that. This is kind of how the ARIA equipment is designed to work. So note, channel stuff, control information is channel specific, clock is universal. Okay. And that's kind of how it works. But then for these instruments that do not observe this, they will need to have the MIDI channel set to receive on the golden channel, whatever the golden channel happens to be. So you kind of have to work this out. MIDI is not a plug and play technology, unfortunately. You do have to sit down in your studio if you're running MIDI and actually work out what is talking to what and then what channel. And if you've watched various videos of mine, you'll know that I have various things like the Mio 10 and the Roland Aira and the Roland 220 and the Roland A11, and they're all devices about controlling MIDI being routed around the studio when the studio was set up. And obviously, as you know, it's all packed up at the moment. But that's what they're all about. Now, there is the downside to MIDI is that, if you've got a device that doesn't allow you to switch off control data, then control data can be received or sent, and it does all kinds of weird and funky things on the receiving device. So, again, I think you kind of need to understand your MIDI implementation on the instrument. Now, I've done quite a lot of videos about setting the instruments up, but I haven't really done anything about understanding the control data, and maybe that's something I need to do as a video in the future. Now, in the situation where you are sending control data, kind of what you need to look at in your MIDI implementation of that particular instrument is whether you can switch it on or off. Most modern instruments will allow you to switch it off. Okay, some legacy stuff you might not be in that position. The other thing is also to make sure that if you have instruments in your MIDI cluster, make sure that they're all not set to Omni, because Omni is receive on all. Okay, and if you're receiving on all, Doesn't matter what channel is being transmitted, your instrument will play when it receives note and control data. So the other thing about the ARIA equipment is you need to make sure that you've got it on a specific clock source. Now, I think out of the box, a number of the devices look externally. If they see an external clock source, they will default to the external clock source. That is kind of the default setup. However, if somebody has changed the MIDI clock explicitly to an internal clock, it doesn't matter whether you've got an external clock source coming in until you change that either to an auto or an external clock source. It's still going to run on the internal clock source of the device that you're talking about. So everything will go out of sync. Now, I agree I didn't go into too much detail on the video. Maybe I should have done, but the video was really about which socket do you plug the cable into. And when I'm talking about cable, I'm talking about one of these things. That's a MIDI cable. See? So which socket do you plug that thing into? That was what the video was all about. It wasn't demonstrating the equipment per se. It was saying, if you want to daisy chain this stuff together and use the clock on the TR8, this is how you do it. Now, the other thing you need to remember is that MIDI was developed in the 1980s. It was really simple for the machines of the time. However, now we've got new MIDI coming in, and the new generation of stuff that's coming out late 2019, 2020 is now starting to sort of adopt the MIDI 2 standard. But all the old machines will not adopt MIDI 2. You have to still run MIDI 1. And there are lots more control over the patterns and what you can send and what you can't send in MIDI version 2 to what you could do in MIDI version 1. But the reality is that MIDI is a headache. It really is. It's actually quite simple, but you kind of need to just sit down and think about it. And it therefore can become a headache for many trying to do stuff. And if you think through the process, and that's kind of what I think the video that I was previously talking about needs to do, is to walk you through my thinking when I do this stuff. And maybe you can understand how I would configure MIDI so that you can understand how you might need to configure MIDI. And I have to be honest and say, I actually rewired my studio 3 times in the past 6 years or so because new equipment had turned up. And every time new equipment turned up, I needed to make things happen in a different way. So once you've got something set up, if you introduce a new piece of equipment, the likelihood is you're going to have to change your MIDI setup or go back to. And what there used to be years and years ago is there used to be a piece of software for Windows. I don't think it was a Mac piece of software. It might have been a Mac piece of software. I can remember seeing it, and I thought that was really good at the time. And could I find it now? No. Does anyone manufacture it now? No, probably not. But it was actually a tool that allowed you to actually draw your studio and how the various components of your studio hooked together and on what channels. And it was really, really useful. And I haven't seen a piece of software like that for a long, long time. It would be really useful. So if anybody out there knows of somebody who is making a MIDI, a studio graphing type piece of software, drop me a comment below this video. I would love to actually have a look at it and see if it helps. Because if you can visually graph out how your studio works, it saves a hell of a lot of time when you're trying to repatch stuff. Anyway, I hope that addresses the technical aspects of the comments that were left. Well, if it doesn't, it doesn't.